Okay, if you're just joining us, again, welcome back. Where we last left off was we went through some CBT definitions, some understanding, some skills, how the ABC framework works, and we touched on metacognition and how it's thinking about thinking. And now we're going to get back into it and look at different ways we can understand deeper meanings about some intermediate topics, if you like, maybe some advanced topics as well. Not in depth, but just to kind of bookend the conversation so that we can do that. Let's just have a quick listen to make sure we're on track and that we're working through some of these things. So the last slide was over here where we talked about metacognition drills. We talked about things like what rumination means and how we can kind of name the process and label what's going on so we can kind of have a sense of what that means for us. So we need to identify what's going on by giving it a name, and that can help, externalize or give the process a name. And then also it serves to be able to, once we've identified and once we know what's going on, that can give us a sense of how do we go about it? How do we change our thinking around this? Oops. Okay. So, nothing sensitive there, I hope. What happens there? What happens when I do that? So I was wanting to look at the health of the stream. Let's bring that up so we can make sure it's up and running properly. Okay. So, welcome to part 2. Let's continue where we left off. And we were, just to recap very quickly, we were talking about if you do a sort of Google search or sort of even just ask ChatGPT to provide you a quick explanation on, make a sort of custom CBT worksheet for you, or sort of some drills that you can kind of work through, that might help. And then we can kind of understand the ABCs of the ABC model pertaining to the CBT modality and the framework there. So we have the antecedent, where something happens in reality, just doing a quick recap. We have the belief, which is sometimes an automatic thought if we're not trained in our thinking about that. And we can kind of have this skill of metacognition, which we're going to go into a little bit just as a conceptual idea, so we can get a better understanding of sort of what's coming up, what's next. And we looked at a bee sting example where, if a bee's floating around and flying near us, the automatic thought might be to run or to try to swat the bee. And when we know the fact that bees only attack if they feel threatened or if they feel there's a risk to the hive, then they'll respond with a deadly sting for themselves and for you, potentially, if you've got an allergy or something. Always keep an EpiPen. The other aspect is the consequence. So from the thought, we have an emotional consequence and we have a behavioral consequence. And then the disputation comes at the sort of D and E level, where we have we're disputing the thought, not the situation, not with another person, but we're sort of having this internal dialogue of disputing what we're thinking about, so that we can use facts to dispel the automatic thoughts and the doubts and the suspicions and the maladaptive cognitions. So we use facts, we use evidence to do that, objective facts. So we're sort of becoming this scientist in the mind to investigate empirically, to derive what it means to debunk that thought in our mind. And then from that, we have effective new beliefs. So the new belief might be, okay, that the bee is not going to sting, that it only does it if there's a threat. Is there a threat? Am I a threat to the bee? Yeah, no, I might be a threat to myself with my handwriting, but otherwise, it's a generally safe situation. Bees just going about collecting its pollen, and information brings us out of ignorance, and otherwise ignorance can breed, unwelcomed emotions and unwelcomed behaviors. Some tips we mentioned about that was, having sort of an attention sprint to train our attention, how we think about things, focus, change the floodlights to a spotlight, and then focus on something for 60 seconds and then build that over time. Also, one of the skills and tips we talked about in terms of having some metacognition drills was to have this sort of scheduled worry time. We might have 10 minutes, it might be 5 minutes for you, it might be 30 minutes for you. It just depends on what you've got on your mind. So instead of worrying all day, the analogy that I often use is if you've got a shopping list. Here we go. If you've got a shopping list and you've got, eggs, milk, and butter. Butter. Yes. Butter. If you're going to the shops, you don't go to the shops 3 times for eggs and then come back home and then go back for milk and then come back home and then go back for butter. All right. You combine the list and then you go to the shops, you collect all 3 and then you come back. And that's the end of shopping. You don't keep visiting the shops. So likewise, when we have worries on our mind, when we have 3, 4 things to worry about or 30 things to worry about, we want to isolate our time so that we have this kind of worry journal, if you like. And we want to focus on the things that we're worried about and compartmentalize them to that part of the day, that space of the day. And the example that I used was maybe it's, can sort of habit stack these, if you like. We can, just before we take a shower or just before or right after we brush our teeth, or something that we already normally do so that we don't have to build a new habit. We're building on top of existing habits, which is a separate conversation, but just as an idea. That can serve to compartmentalize, just like the shopping list. Do I need to keep going shopping? No, I've already been shopping. That's done. It's out of the way. The to-do list item is done. We tick it off. We move on with our lives. Do I need to keep worrying about these 3 things throughout the day? No, I've done my worrying. I wrote it down. I've documented it. I've recorded it. I've handled it. It was compartmentalized. I had a meeting with myself and it's done. I've ticked off the items of my worry list. And then that was at the beginning of the day. And if you do that regularly, then every time you finish brushing your teeth, you do your worry journal at a scheduled time. That's it. You don't have to keep revisiting and worrying about those over and over again. Okay, so now we're looking at the next part here. So one of the things that we sometimes look at when we're working through this aspect of what we might say when we have sort of the ABCD model, let's just keep it at ABC at the moment, okay? And when we have a consequence, remember, it's an emotion or it's a behavior. It's an action or a behavior. I sometimes say feelings and actions, and then emotions and behaviors. Okay. One of the things we can do is we have this kind of one way to sort of check in with ourselves is to have this BIP. What's happening to our body? My handwriting again. What's happening? What's the intensity? And then what's happening to our physiology? And that can serve to kind of give us a quick way. Where's your BIP at? Right. So give you a sort of way to measure and check in what's going on with the emotion specifically. We can sort of look at other ways to do that as well. But that's what this is talking about. Your body is a part of the model, because if you're cramped up, if you feel tension, muscular tension in your shoulders, if you feel you're gnawing or you're crunching or you're biting your lip, or you're biting your nails, or you're fidgeting, or you're swinging your legs, or you're sort of leaning back and being in certain positions. What's happening to your body? Tight chest, tight jaw, a shallow breath. If you're feeling agitated, if you're feeling itchy and scratchy, that can kind of be a sign. So these are indications. Okay, you're not diseased. You're not ill, you're not unwell. You're noticing these. These are the symptoms. So when you start picking these up, again, we can start reverse engineering some of these and kind of doing the investigative work, being the scientist of the self, and kind of building that literacy of our body and what's going on, why that's happening. So like I'm doing now, just take a breath, just a slow exhale. All right, do a posture reset. People do that. You see this sometimes. People sitting at the masjid, they're sort of stretching. They've got this. They're arching their backs, or they don't do this. But people click their necks, or they'll crunch their knuckles, or something like that. They'll pop they'll pop certain parts of their body. Just micro movements. Just loosen up and just kind of become aware of where you're positioned in space. Sort of. Developing even a skill with proprioception and how you are, where you are in space, and how you present to yourself. Look at yourself in the mirror. If you've got recordings of yourself, you can analyze that, not to the point of paralysis, but just to be aware of what's going on, so that it's feedback, it's informational. Okay. And then you can test the thought and run a little experiment like we said earlier, and then we can sort of regulate and then look at the reason of what's going on. Okay. Regulate, then we sort of reason. What does that mean? That means if we've got, I need to sort of remove this. It's getting a bit annoying. If anyone maybe agrees, drop a comment on how annoying this stream is out of 10. Where did I put that? Here we go. All right. Hopefully we get some relief by removing that from the screen. Okay. So when we regulate, when we've got an idea of how intense our emotions are, sorry about jumping back and forth with the screen, I'm just trying to be illustrative here. But if we've got an idea of where our body is in space, what's going on there, if we've got an idea of intensity, you might use a scale, 0 to 1 or 0 to 10, excuse me, or 0 to 100 if it's as a percentage. Something's going on with my handwriting today. And then we've got a sense of our physiology. Is our heart rate faster? Is our breath rate faster? Is it restricted? Is it shallow breath? Are we breathing from our chest? Are we breathing from our belly? So these things can be indications. Once we've got an idea of that, then we can regulate. If our breath is fast, we can use ourselves to sort of calm down. Sometimes reading something, reciting Quran, going for a walk, doing some exercise, and that can sort of build that. And I remember I told someone once about how, increasing your stamina can have protective factors about this. And so there are studies which obviously, it's probably general knowledge these days, but it was at the peak of its crossover with physiology and psychology back in the day. I think it might have been someone named Gasser, Gasser, from memory, how they found the link between physiology and psychology and how they're linked. And so when you're a fit person, you don't have to be a phenomenon about it in terms of like in peak fitness, but when you have some levels of cardiovascular tolerance and you can tolerate exercise, that can help you manage the intensity. That can help you understand where your body is and tolerate aches and pains. Or, for example, if your heart rate goes up very quickly or too much, too high, being fit in terms of your cardiovascular capacity, having a good VO2 max and so on, that can really sort of help curtail some of the distress you might otherwise feel in circumstances where, say, anxiety comes. So once we know those, we can regulate, and then we can sort of reason with ourselves and be a little bit more cerebral, be a little bit more intellectual, be a bit more rational about it. Okay, so that's where we kind of go up the hierarchy in terms of how CBT fits in under the umbrella of rational, emotional, behavioral therapies, REBTs, or RBT sometimes. And there's lots of variations of these. So a breathing visual might be, for example, where sometimes we have this idea of, rectangular breathing. Rectangular breathing. So rectangular breathing is kind of, let's say that's a rectangle there, and we want to exhale for a long breath and then inhale for a short breath and just keep going around. Okay. I'm going to rotate this so we can, silly. We've got to exhale for a long breath and then inhale for a short breath. So when you do that, you can sort of regulate how you're disposing of your carbon dioxide when you're exhaling, and then you're inhaling less oxygen. So you might kind of, and you could do this, nasally as well through your nostril, and just kind of no one needs to know. You're going to hear it because I'm close to the mic, but otherwise it might just look like this. Short breath in and then long breath out. And a few of those, you'll find the need to come back and have a regular breath. But essentially what you're doing is you're expelling the carbon dioxide in your body, and you're taking less oxygen in, which is sort of signaling less heart rate, less movement needed to mobilize that oxygen around the oxygen particles around your system. So the heart, you're sort of tricking, if you like, it's kind of mind over matter or matter over mind. You're using your body to control your breath rate and thus your heart rate as well. Heart rate variability, take a screenshot, have a look at it and see what's going on. If you measure, if you've got a kind of a wearable that you're using to track your physiological markers, then that might be useful to you. So, you don't want to over measure to the point where you've got a new problem, but at the same time, it might just be helpful to get a bit of a baseline at least. Okay, so some intermediate topics. We've got a couple more slides there. I'm on slide 20, and I've got 21, 22, 23, 24. Last couple of sort of outros anyway. So there's really only 3 slides to go. You're welcome to tune out anytime and speed this up if you want to. All right, so intermediate cognitive behavioral therapy. Let's do a retake. Intermediate cognitive behavioral therapy topics are kind of where a lot of short courses and brief interventions stop, and that's where I think the benefit of being engaged in therapeutic treatment, psychological treatment, whether with someone like myself or a counselor or a coach or a professional or a clinician that actually knows some of these things, that can get deeper into kind of the core beliefs, understanding schemata, different ways that you might think about things, how you define things, if you fit into a particular sort of prototype or a mold or a kind of set of character traits. And that can build your understanding around your competence, around your conceptualization of your self-worth or how you value things, and your sense of control. Something also we call behavioral activation. Long story short, it just means get it done, just do it. Okay, this is kind of the takeaway idea, the thought of being able to take action, and then the thoughts and the cognitions and the emotions will just follow. If you know a course of action is the right thing to do for you, that's healthier, that's more adaptive, that's going to be for everyone's benefit, that's going to help you, especially for low mood. We sometimes talk about behavioral activation as it pertains to depression-related pathologies. And so people who might be burning out and they just can't muster up the courage. There's fatigue. There's a problem with getting moving because of the thoughts that might be kind of coming in. And if you remember, I'll just jump back very quickly for the benefit of everyone, but the CBT model kind of looks at this idea of how thoughts affect behaviors, or vice versa, can go this way as well. But this is usually where we jump the gun. This is kind of an A to C situation, okay? But what we want to do is we want to manage, we want to have this, once we have the cognition, there's an emotionality that happens. And once we have this emotion, there's a belief that sort of leads to that. There's a forget my handwriting on paper and my handwriting on screen is atrocious. So thank you for the negative compliments. We have a belief, and then that results in emotions, and then that can kind of affect our actions and our behaviors. All right. So when we've got that understanding, in terms of how that happens, we can sort of think about mobilizing so that our thoughts don't paralyze us, figuratively speaking. All right. So behavioral activation is a way to, it's a good search key. We can measure that, but essentially we schedule activities and then we measure how things are before and after we perform that activity. And then we rate for ourselves how effective that behavior was. And we can either continue, but it just helps mobilize, just gets us unstuck. So exposure therapy, if you've heard of exposure therapies, usually for, anxiety and trauma related, sometimes we can work with those. There are different modalities. Again, this is informational today, and I better put this on the screen so that we don't have any problems later on, but this might help to just have this, might have helped to do this a little bit earlier. And so the idea is to have a sense of self-care, self-diligence, to be able to kind of work through and deliberately expose. So the dichotomy, if you like, or the way we separate these things without getting too technical, is we have a kind of, for things that we're anxious about, that we're avoidant of, we can think about that as escapism could be one of those, or doing something that's unhelpful. That could be avoidance on one hand. Then on the other hand, we have approach. So when you think about things from a frame of, am I avoiding? Am I approaching? Okay. So if I get nervous around meeting new people and I'm avoidant, I'm going to end up with less friends more and more over time. Whereas if I approach, I'm going to become more accustomed to that discomfort. So the gold standard of dealing with and working with these things is to kind of think about it as a sort of avoidance and approach. Okay, approach and avoidance. And that way, through repeated approaching exposure, we kind of have this, let's say there's a sort of, 0 to 10 level of anxiety. And over time, the first repetition, the first approach might be a higher spike of anxiety, and then it subsides, it comes down. And then the second repetition might be less. And then the third repetition, over time, it's going to flatten out. Can you see what's happening to that curve? And so as we do that, we've exposed ourselves to the distress in controlled ways through conversations with a qualified clinician. Don't take it upon yourself. And there's different models and different ways that we can approach this sort of in vivo, imaginal exposure, gradual exposure, and different ways of sort of desensitizing ourselves to these things. Communication experiments, learning assertiveness skills, establishing boundaries, finding different ways, communicating how we might say yes or no to certain things so that we don't feel like we're being passive to the point of, putting ourselves in situations that are either compromising to our well-being or putting others at risk as well. All right, so that can be important. So it gets deeper. The skills sort of permeate outwards, okay? And one way to sort of think about that is to kind of have a think in terms of like if we've got a core concept here, let's say that's sort of CBT. This is just something that I'm just thinking of now, but we can sort of spiral. We can sort of spiral around. It can still be considered and related to a cognitive approach, but here you might learn about assertiveness. And then here you might learn about social skills. And then here you might sort of have some ideas around, breathing. And then somewhere else you might kind of focus on, as you go. So we're always building on this kind of core, and we're spiraling sort of outward. And then we can sort of revisit those as we go. And a treatment plan will typically have these sorts of roadmap. So you're getting some ideas about it here, but when you seek therapy and when you see a psychologist, usually they'll have a treatment plan for your presentation, for your condition, for something you've talked about, and that can help inform, after measuring, what your symptoms might be, what your outcome goals are. That can give you a sense of some direction in terms of what your expectations are and how we can align those to best treat the situation with evidence-based tools and practices. And one of those strong evidence bases, and there are like any scientifically derived frameworks and principles. There's always an academic debate about them in terms of their strengths and weaknesses and where they flourish and where they may fall short. You don't often have a scientific approach that is, a sort of silver bullet, a magic pill approach to these things. So when we get into advanced territory with regard to CBT, we're looking at deeper work where we're looking at more intricate and nuanced elements and approaches to metacognition. We might build systems around that so that we get into the habit of building a loop around these things so that it becomes more and more ingrained in deeper work. So what does that mean? We can start looking at things like perfectionism, how intolerance, we can sort of build an intolerance, a stress. We can build a stress tolerance and understanding this idea of intolerance, of uncertainty. Metacognitive beliefs that, thinking about worrying keeps me sharp. Okay, this could be something that we could try to address, that your thinking about your thinking could be problematic, but it could also be, a sense of relief as well. We can start looking at somatic elements, and somatic just means pertaining to the body and sensations and feeling in terms of your physiology and your actual body. So what are the panic cues? Is there shaking? Is there trembling? Is there clenching your jaw? Is there clenching the fist? Is your Kegel tensed? Okay. Trauma triggers. If there's certain things that prompt flashbacks that make you think about things in the past as though they're happening right now, and that can be paralyzing. Frankly, it's a serious thing. But we can work through those. So even approaches like trauma-focused CBT, for example, values-based action where acceptance and commitment therapy can cross over. And so we can see these as a bit of a roadmap that we all of these approaches can become stepping stones. And if you recall, there was an analogy that I gave earlier about cognitive distortions, where the way we think about things and the way we interpret reality can be distorted because of the frame with which we're observing reality. Just like my physical glass lenses here, if they're distorted, I'm going to start seeing rectangles as giant blobs. I'm not going to see the sharp edges because of the blurry lenses. But if I know that, okay, in reality, it's a perfect rectangle, right? And when I put on the glasses, I'm seeing it with a blob. I can compensate. I can make the adjustment. Same thing. If I'm thinking someone says something to me and if I might be wearing sensitive cognition lenses and I'm looking at it through distorted lenses, then I'm going to become offended. I'm going to become sensitive. I might react aggressively, and that's not going to be good for them, good for me. And it's just unhealthy. So when you recognize what lenses you're looking at reality through, that can help you identify and compensate accordingly. And then the deeper stuff that I'm really passionate about is kind of aligning identity with our actual selves, how we present in reality. Let's call it our public selves and our private selves. And sometimes, this idea of imposter syndrome, or not really being who we want to be. We're not actualizing our true self is not manifesting in reality, in the sense that our intention is not actualizing with regards to how we're acting, the decisions we're making. It might not matter too much, but sometimes it might matter in circumstances where how we want to be, or how we think we want to be, can not be how we're being perceived, whether it's our own perception or other elements. But anyway, I don't want to digress too much. We can build a habit architecture. We can sort of redesign ourselves, find these crisis points that define us, that we struggle through, and there's pain and there's suffering, and that we can emerge and use that as a kind of crisis to rebuild from, rather than keep us knocked down. Okay. So the values-based approach and then the longer-term identity building a habit architecture around how we might approach our sense of purpose, what we find important to our lives, what we do about things that matter, how we incorporate our values into our decision making, then that could be something that we can look at. If, for instance, let's go into focus mode. If, for instance, I have this idea of being economic with the money that I earn, but when it comes to my actual behavior, I'm spending everywhere carelessly. I don't budget, and then I end up with budget problems. I can't pay bills. I can't buy food. I can't pay rent. So internally, I become torn. You can have a sort of dissonance, a cognitive dissonance about this. And to resolve that somehow, we need to kind of work through either through a redesigning of the self. Maybe we're being too harsh with ourselves. Maybe we've got expectations that are not realistic. Maybe we need to find a way to reconcile that. And it's, again, quality discussions and conversations that kind of help, kind of close that gap. The two Venn diagrams that don't seem to meet of the ideal self and the actual self are kind of apart, and we're trying to bring those together into some sort of harmony, inshallah. All right, I've got a bit of a challenge for us over here. Let's think about what you can do next. All right. I was going to put a link here. I'll put up a makeshift QR code. So what I'll do is I will maybe pop up on the screen. I don't want to really edit this stream, but I'll put a link in the description if nothing else. But I'll pop a link to some of these worksheets, some of these materials, and your CBT challenge. If you want to sort of challenge yourself, the key is small reps, and you want to compound them. The accumulative effect is important. So on day 1 and 2, just do these one at a time. Just have a listen and look at the overview, so you've got an idea of where it's all going. But then start somewhere and don't move forward until you've kind of conquered that particular, day or two. Okay. So on day 1 or 2, just spot your automatic thoughts. Just understand where your mind starts making fake facts. Okay. Day 3 and 4, just 1 to 5, do your 5-column checklist. Okay. And the 5-column checklist is over here. We want to look at the situation, the automatic thoughts, the emotional percentage in terms of its intensity and its effect and how severe it might be. Then we look at the evidence associated with that, so we can debunk that mental myth. And then what action are we going to take? What's the behavior that we're kind of working on there? And that can be the 5-column check-in that you could do on day 2 or 3. And so from there, back on day 5 and 6, we can run a behavioral experiment perhaps and kind of find a way to increase our actual practice. And some things have happened through approach, happen through, when I say practice with an S, to actually do it, to implement it, to execute, to action, to manifest, to get it done. And so repetition with that can teach us how to fail, how we can kind of move forward and deal with the rejection of the absence of success, and kind of go back, take a step back and move forward again. So then we can sort of review outcomes, just like if you were on a job, if you were an analyst, if you were a specialist, if you were data-driven and working on something in a way where you collect information, you reflect on that information, and then you improve that. And that can help you pick different areas of focus over time. So use the data just like you would with your business, just like you would with your website, just like you would with your car. You have certain metrics, you have certain instrumentation that's showing you certain things. The tire pressure, for instance, monitoring that can give you a sense of what's going on. And you use that to either inflate or to deflate your tires, for instance. That's informational. When you have that data, you can take that action. Without that, you just can't. You won't know whether your tires are properly inflated or not. All right, so we're going to pause there, and just to give you an idea of sort of how deep that goes and how far out it can spiral, or how deep it can spiral. If you found this useful, we're going to have a look at our quick disclaimer here. Just understand that this is all educational only. No, sort of therapeutic relationship has been formed here. Understand that. I know this is a bit boring and draggy, but it's general education, and it doesn't replace therapy. Nothing can. And so it's important to engage with a qualified clinician if you're able to, and keep consuming this kind of content so you understand more about yourself, so that you're more prepared before you go into a session, perhaps, and that can be a huge benefit sometimes. If there's a risk of harm, contact your local emergency services or see your treater, see your physician immediately. If your symptoms persist, find a qualified professional, and viewer discretion is advised, of course. So with that, if this was useful, if you liked what you saw today, if you didn't like what you saw today, drop me a comment. Tell me a little bit about it. What can I do? What can I improve on? How can I make this more specific to you? Just like I was talking about data before, I need to be able to use some of that data for the stream as well, for the channel. So it's important that I develop that skill myself, and it's something that I'm new at. So any ideas, any thoughts, any topics that you're interested in, let me know. And we are tuned into Mindspan HQ, and YouTube seems to be home base, but I'll try to stream and push content out in other places, inshallah. So subscribe if you want to get updates. Ramadan's coming up, and we've got 5-6 days to go. It's the 11th of February today, and we want to maybe focus on more topics that are of interest to the audience and to the community, if there's ever a community that's going to build. And that would be nice. Rather than talking to a camera and mic, it'd be lovely to get some feedback and get some conversation going. I'm used to sort of having a discussion, listening. I love listening, and I love asking questions and helping people discover themselves through, compassionate curiosity and deeper understanding, and peeling away the layers at everyone's pace and allowing them to arrive at their own conclusion. So, these are sort of tricks and tips, and sometimes they can be very useful, and I hope you found it useful. But I like to focus on sort of cutting through the crap and just focusing on grounded psychology. I don't mean crap in the crappy sense, but I'm talking about, sometimes irrelevant things. Like I could have gone through a whole history of Beck and Alice's relationship and how CBT kind of splintered off into various elements. But nonetheless, we jumped straight into it. So, when you see someone in person, it can be a bit jarring at first. It does take a little bit of courage. And so I encourage everyone to kind of find a therapist, an in-person therapist in their local area, whether it's in person or face-to-face, whether it's via Zoom or in the flesh. It's really useful, and it can help you become a better person. And one of the things that I'm very passionate about is advocating for, especially mental health, growth and development, aligning purpose with action for men specifically as well. And that's important to factor in, because there's, in our deen and in our gender, it can be a little bit overwhelming and stigmatic, and there are certain taboos associated with that. And so it's a good discussion, whether you agree or disagree. Let me know in the comments if you feel strongly about it this way or that way, and I would love to engage. But otherwise, you can find me at Mindspan HQ. My name's Ilker. I'm a psychologist, and today was about some CBT ideas on how we can, as executives, as executive parents, as executive students, as executive fathers and sons, we can sort of connect better through understanding how our thoughts affect our emotions and how our emotions affect our subsequent actions. All right. So thank you again for your attention, and I shall see you on the next one, inshallah. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
This channel is built deliberately. Each series is research, structured, and designed to support real change and transformation in your thinking, in your character, psychological functioning, and lived values and experience. If this work is useful to you, your engagement matters. Liking, commenting, subscribing, connecting helps the platform recognize that this kind of careful, non-sensational work is worth showing to others who are also trying to grow with depth and integrity. That support keeps projects like this sustainable. So thank you.